what about food? Highly controversial topic, but when it comes to longevity, I guess three things come to mind for me at a very high level when it comes to food. It's how much food we're eating, when we're eating, and what we're eating. So if you firstly, I guess, just speak to those three buckets, would you be able to prioritize those and say, in terms of your longevity, this is the number one, that's the number two, that's the number three?
That's a good way to try and shorten what could be another podcast or two or three. I think the most important is what you eat. And I think that's the thing we've got by far the best evidence for. And I think then the sort of how much you eat and when you eat is far, far harder both to quantify, but also to stick to. And I know that you talked a bit with Matt about this in his podcast as well. The challenge is that as you get closer to humans in these animal experiments, let's rewind all the way back to the beginning of this sort of science. Back in the 1930s, it was found that if you fed rats quite significantly less, they seem to live a bit longer. And so if you feed a rat like 40-50% less, this isn't just a diet, this is like a substantial cutback in the amount of food they're consuming. But crucially, you make sure they get fewer calories, they get fewer of all the macronutrients, but you make sure that they get all of the micronutrients they need, all the vitamins, all the minerals, and so on. So it's a very carefully optimized diet. You find that these rats that are eating 40-50% less live 40-50% longer. And this is an incredible result because, again, like the Senolytics, these rats aren't having the frailty extended. They seem to be living healthier for longer as well. They look better. And when they did little rat autopsies on the rats after they'd died, regardless of which group they were in, they looked very similar. So there was a similar amount of cancer in both groups, even though one of them was living half as long again, which is just this absolutely incredible result. And it sort of shocks me that we didn't then do immediately more experiments on this. But this is a field that lay fallow for sort of 30, 40, 50 years after that. But suddenly, in the sort of latter half of the 20th century, there was a rekindled interest in this. And we've tried it now in loads of different species. We tried it in yeast and worms and flies and guppies and trout and pond fleas and dogs and all kinds of different creatures. And what you seem to find is that as we get closer and closer to humans, the effect of the calorie restriction seems to get less pronounced. So, for example, a nematode, I think you can triple its lifespan by doing the best form of calorie restriction. A mouse, I think you can add about 50%. Dogs, it's more like 16%, I think, in the best experiment. It's worth saying there have been fewer experiments in these longer-lived animals as well, which might be a bit of a distortion because obviously it takes ages to do a calorie restriction experiment in a long-lived animal. But then if we go all the way to monkeys, which is the sort of closest to humans that we've got, there were these two experiments done in rhesus monkeys, which started in the late 80s and lasted for sort of 30 years after that. And I think all the monkeys are now dead, so the results are fully in, but there might be a couple still sort of hanging on. What they found was, unfortunately, the two different groups who did these two separate experiments found contradictory results. And so they found, one group found that the monkeys did live a little bit longer and a little bit healthier. Another group found that they didn't live any longer, but they did live healthier. And so there's this, we could talk for another 15, 20 minutes about the details of that if you want to, but I think that the sort of key result there is that it's not entirely clear what's going on in those monkey experiments. And I don't think there's a huge appetite, no pun intended, to repeat those experiments because they're huge, expensive, lengthy trials. This is something that, as I say, went from like the late 80s to 2020 or so. And unfortunately, of course, the results weren't 100% conclusive. All we've got in humans in terms of calorie restriction studies is experiments that look at very, very short periods of time. So obviously there are groups around the world that do this for extended periods. There are religious sects and stuff that eat a substantially reduced diet and have done that for their whole lives. But often, again, they have other systematic differences with the rest of the population that makes it hard to do the comparison. So the best randomized clinical evidence that we have is, I think, for 2 years was the length of this trial called CALERIE, which looked into the sort of physiological changes that happen. Obviously, they can't say anything about human lifespan in that period of time. What they could say is that these people did seem to get healthier in most ways. So their blood insulin response improved, and think typical blood tests that you do, they seem to get better.
Do you know what sort of calorie deficit those people were able to sustain over 2 years?
I think they were aiming for 25%. So they let them eat what they wanted for a week and then said, right, you're going to eat 25% less. But I think actually the compliance was more like 12% because it's just really, really hard. Like, anyone who's ever tried a diet, it's exhausting. And imagine doing that for like 2 years. Because what I was going to go on to say, the problem is the side effects. And the side effects, number one, the hunger does not go away. You might think that once you've been doing it for a year and a half, maybe your body's got used to this calorie deficit and so you're going to be in a state. But most people reported that they still felt hungry all the time, which is, no fun. There's this joke in longevity circles that calorie restriction might not make you live any longer, but it'll certainly feel like longer. And you can really see, I am not a happy person when I'm hungry. So if that was literally me 24/7, I don't think it's necessarily worth it, even if there is any lifespan benefit, which we actually don't know the answer to. And there are also other sort of more serious side effects. So a few people had to drop out of the trial because of anemia, so reduced iron in their blood. And so I ended up having to eat a bit more because of that. There's also the risk of reduced bone density that a few people were observed to have. And there's also the risk of reduced immunity. So again, it's really hard to know what this means in lifespan terms. Because if you think about the experiments that are done in mice, these mice live in this cosseted lab environment. They're really carefully kept what's called germ-free. So they're free of any kind of pathogens, viruses, bacteria. But if you're a human and, you're wandering around in the world where we have flu, we have colds, we have pandemics, we have all kinds of different stuff, I don't want to be living in that world with a reduced immune function. And theoretically, I could live to 120, but I'm going to get knocked over at 80 by some dose of the flu. So it's really, really hard to know what to recommend.